Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So nice to see you all here. I'm seeing you in a long line, but it's wonderful to know that we have 105 people who have taken the time out of their incredibly busy lives to join us for what I know is going to be the beginning of an important and continuing community conversation and learning experiences, all intentionally focused and determined to make Stevens better. This is a time for all of us for reflection and listening and learning. And I just want to take a minute to share with you all some of my own journey. I've spent a lot of time, as we all have, in recent days and weeks, trying to do my best to learn and to listen. And I've learned a lot. And I want to thank in particular Shashan Dial, who will speak with us today, for her guidance and her insight and her courage. And I want to thank so many of my colleagues and Sarah Crosby, a board member who does a great deal of important work in the area of diversity and equity and inclusion. And I want to thank so many of our alumni. There's in particular, a group of passionate and committed and caring alumni who have been sharing their ideas and, oh, there's my sign, and anger and disappointment about some of the things that have happened in our past and some of the things that they see happening today. And I genuinely and authentically want to thank them. They have sent us at least some version of a list of their demands that Stevens get better. And I hear them. And I agree with you. We need to get better. And I'm asking and inviting you, those of you who want to be part of that discussion, to meet with me and Shashan and Leslie Willey, our Vice President of Academic Affairs, because some of the things that in the collective document speak directly to our curriculum and our faculty. And I'd like to do that early next week so that we can begin together to talk about how we can make change. I appreciate very much that words are sound bites and that action is what matters. And I want you to know that the impact is already clear. We sent out a statement. It was heartfelt and genuine and true on Sunday afternoon about the college's principles and values and 10 ideals. And at the time, you know, it seemed like the right statement to make. And a lot of people looked at it, and a lot of people joined us in recommitting to those values. But we got feedback from our community that the time for words is over and the time for action is pressing and now. And you were right. And so we spent a couple of days talking and thinking and listening. And thanks again to my colleagues, and particularly Shashan. I think we made progress. I think we stepped forward and took a stand. And in some worlds and some communities, that's a baby step. I mean, that's a baby step. For us, it was an important step because we stand with and for instead of talking about. And for me, as the president of Stevens for the past 11 years, for me, it represents a different kind of commitment and an important next step for us to become the Stevens College of today and tomorrow. It's going to take the collective efforts of all of us. But I say with humility that I don't know what I don't know, and that I am learning and working hard on the hard work of learning to listen. Our second statement was a statement of principle, but also a statement of action. And it was our best effort. And 100 dozen people read that statement over and over and over again. And we were proud when it went out. But it spelled the names wrong of Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery, which is a deep disrespect. It wasn't intentional, but it mattered. And it's a reminder that best intentions are necessary but insufficient, and that we must get better at execution and action. So I pledge to you that the hard work ahead is important work, and we will undertake it. And I invite those of you who want to walk with us and participate in that hard work to join us. I particularly invite those of you who contributed to, developed, delivered, and are passionate about that list of demands to engage with us directly and to interact with us regularly in the weeks and months ahead. I'd appreciate it if you would get back to me and let me know who and if you would be interested and willing to do that, and we will schedule a meeting early next week to have those conversations and to begin that hard work together. Today, we are engaged in what we all need to do more of, and that's learning. We're an educational institution, we're Stevens, but we're human beings, and every one of us has a lot of learning to do. I am going to do now what I am learning to do better, and that is to shut up and listen. So I'd like to introduce Shashawn Dial, our founding director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, who has lots of important things to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you, President Lynch. Good afternoon, and thank you to the members of our Stevens community. So we welcome traditional residential online students, our online students, our graduate students. Welcome to staff, welcome to faculty, welcome to our board of trustees, welcome to our alumni, and welcome to folks who occupy multiple identities within that. So we welcome you, and we thank you for making the time and the space to be here, especially our Columbia residents as well. So I am Shashawn Dial. It is my honor to serve as the inaugural Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with Stevens. And I'm also very proud to be an alumna, class of 1998. So it's a pleasure and a gift, really, to be navigating the spaces that I did between 18 and 22, some 20 odd years later. There is a mental, physical, spiritual growth that is very unique. And so I'm grateful to serve in this capacity. So today, as we're gathered virtually, we want to start off with which happens in a lot of social justice traditions, and that's centering. Some communities call it grounding. Some communities call it simply intentional breathing. So I'm going to ask, right, that you suspend any challenges or resistance to the following exercise. It will be brief. But I ask right now that we center ourselves. So wherever you are able, if you're able to, I know some of you are traveling and some of you are with young little people. And so as best as you can, try to get comfortable where you are standing or sitting. Try to uncross any of your limbs. And we want to just take a moment and whatever feels comfortable to you in your traditions or lack of traditions, and acknowledge everything that has brought you to this moment right now. We acknowledge each of our individual journeys, the communities we've come from, the fact that we've survived yet another moment, minute, hour, day, week, and especially the last couple of weeks that have been intense and heartbreaking and frustrating. So we just give space to acknowledge. We want to honor those who came before us, especially those who are the original folks of these lands in Columbia, Missouri. So we want to lift up and honor the Chickasaw, the Kiwi, and the Osage Native Americans, Indigenous people. And we honor all of our ancestors who have danced and celebrated and sacrificed and bled and prayed and died for us to be in this moment. I ask that you just take a second and express gratitude for anything and everything, everyone and anyone. Whether that's food, shelter, clothing, transportation, loved ones, technology for us to be able to gather in this space. We want to acknowledge the lives and loved ones of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Ahmaud Arbery, and literally thousands of others who unnecessarily their lives were taken and their loved ones left to grieve and mourn and protest and try to find purpose in a mess. And we want to acknowledge that we continue to navigate a pandemic that is impacting us all mentally, physically, spiritually, economically, and we hold space that it is disproportionately impacting communities of color, Black, Latinx, African, Caribbean, Indigenous. So I ask now that you take 3 intense, deep breaths. Most of us are doing shallow breathing as we navigate our days. And when it comes to doing this work, specifically work around race, around oppression, around the isms, as we call them, we are doing shallow breathing, and we need to do the opposite. We need to breathe in deep to bring in oxygen and openness, and we need to release deeply in order to let go of the toxins, right? And our comfort, because we need to embrace getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. So go ahead and take a minute and take 3 breaths according to your own rhythm. Thank you for participating. So for the rest of our time together, for the next, I'm going to do my best, 20, 25 minutes, we're going to go through a collective vocabulary, right? One of the first important pieces of doing any social justice, anti-racism work is that we need to define terms, because way too often we are bringing pop culture connotations and individual or communal connotations to words that really do have formal definitions. Many of the ones I'll share today are from the United Nations 2001 delegation. And so this is global, but a lot of our focus for our time today is in the US context. So I will go over some of these slides and some of this information, and then we're going to open it up, and we hope that you all will share resources. I see lots of activity already in the chat, so you can do that, and hopefully we'll have some time where we can unmute and you can evolve and expand about resources or answer questions, and then we'll go from there. So we need a social justice framework as we're doing this work. And remember, we're coming to it as students, staff, faculty, board of trustees, alumni, and people who engage with our larger Columbia, Missouri communities. So racism, like all forms of oppression, is pervasive and it hurts us all. Let's repeat that. It hurts us all, white people and people of color. It does not harm us in the same way. So therefore, we have different work to do. Racism is both a system of oppression and a system of advantage based on skin color. So that simply means that there are advantages and certain groups are celebrated, seen, visible, and other groups are invisible or are not seen or are treated more harshly. All racial prejudice was taught to us. And many of us have been resisting those teachings. However, it's challenging, and we're going to talk about that. What we can do in this moment moving forward is choose to unlearn some of the myths and the lies that we've been taught. None of us invented racism. It is something that we inherited. Not one of us created it. We have another choice to make today, though, and that's, do we accept the responsibility and our role in its continued existence? This is one of those very few moments where it is binary. If you are not actively working against racism, then you are complicit in its continued existence. And all prejudices and oppressions are interwoven and entangled. So yes, for this moment in time, we are focused on racism and always will be. Racism, however, is not in its a singular piece. Oppression is tied to age, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, faith orientation, veteran status, sex, physical ability, cognitive ability, linguistic ability, behavioral ability. So they are all tied. Social justice framework continued. All of us have had the experience, unfortunately, of being a target of oppression and experiencing privilege. It can be fluid on the individual and communal level. We will also spend some time talking about the systemic level. There is no such thing as a passive anti-racism. So some of you may be that passive aggressive person in your life, or you may know some. We cannot be passive anti-racist. We are either, again, actively working against racism, or we are colluding with it and allowing it to continue. Hope. Individuals, communities, and organizations can and do grow and change. It is not a destination that we will arrive, but we can make a whole lot of progress in the process. Our commitment to eliminating racism and all forms of injustice has to be a lifelong one. Diane set the tone. We don't know what we don't know. That is the first step of cultural humility. And we will walk that journey or navigate that journey, however we do, for the rest of our lives until we take our last breath. That's the work we're signing up for. And difference among humans is not a deficit. Cultural diversity is a gift. The last piece is that you'll hear me say people of color, and I've already said it. And it's important that we name that we know that that is our indigenous kin, sometimes known as Native Americans, Black, Caribbean, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, those from the Middle Eastern diaspora, biracial and multiracial. Why is it important to name those? Because for most of us in the US context, we go back to the binary. And if we say people of color, people always think Black, or they make it a Black and white issue. And the challenge with that is that it looks like we are the quote minority. However, in a world population of 7.5 billion, there are approximately, and you can look at the numbers, right? 850 million whites, but look at the number of people of color. And that is important because if you only spend your life in the US context, then you have internalized the racism that you are of the disadvantaged, that you are in the low in number, that you are a minority. But truly, people of color are part of a global community. And so again, it's important when we do this work that we look at contexts because we're internalizing these messages that we've gotten. And I put a quick note there that we are in the census, so please fill out your census if you haven't. But just to show how complicated this is, in the 2020 census, individuals with ethnic origins from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa are classified as white. So when we talk about the social construct of race, this is global and it is deep. So let's jump right in. So reviewing some of the community language. So I don't know about you, but I'll admit, right, that I used to use these two synonymously, stereotype and prejudice. I just mixed them up. There's a huge difference, right? A stereotype is an oversimplified generalization of a social group that attributes specific characteristics to the members of that group, which are not necessarily true. So it's a generalization. However, a prejudice is an attitude. And more times than not, it's a negative attitude towards a social group based on biased perception or a real or imagined characteristic of that group. Now, the distinction between these two becomes really important when we define oppression and we define systemic isms, because those have prejudice in the equation, not so much stereotype. Discrimination. That is a course of action that denied fair treatment for a person based on their membership in a group. So if you're following along, you've got the stereotype and oversimplified generalization. You've got prejudice, a negative attitude. Now we've got discrimination, which is a course of action. Many of the first two, prejudice and stereotypes, can be on the individual or communal. Often discrimination starts to happen solely on a communal level. And then we have oppression. And this equation changed my life, so I offer it as a gift to you, which is oppression is prejudice plus institutional or systemic power. And we often say misuse of institutional and systemic power. So many of you have survived decades of different vocabularies. In the 90s, I always say it was kumbaya, right? Let's share recipes, let's break bread together, and we called that diversity. Or equity, or inclusion, or equality, or inclusiveness. And again, you might be using them synonymously. And I think as a community at Stevens, we're committed to knowing that there are very important distinctions between them. So diversity, it is the components of identity. These are just a fraction. Sex, what you were assigned at birth. Disability, many of us always focus on physical, but there's cognitive, there's linguistic, there's behavioral. There's our age, our race, our ethnicity, our nationality, our socioeconomic status, our gender identity, our veteran status, our gender expression, our faith orientations or no formal faith orientations, sexual orientations, geography, political ideology, personality, lived experiences, the list goes on and on and on. They are the individual components of us. We have equality. And I always say, these are great for social media, the little bar sign, right? Treating everyone the same or giving everyone the same, regardless of their individual or group attributes. However, the challenge is it erases differences. It assumes that there can be neutral spaces. It assumes colorblindness, and it denies the negative ongoing impacts of historical isms. So this is why one of the first steps you can take on this journey of anti-racism is to take certain phrases out of your vocabulary, like, I don't see color, right? Because what's the challenge with that? Then you're saying, I don't see something that's fundamentally important to you and how you navigate the world. So we are striving towards equity. We want to account for the differences in individual and group attributes because of their experiences within US systems and US social systems. We want to achieve equal outcomes. We can't just try to be positive and have the best of intentions. That does not resist against, in the US, the 400 years of the way US social institutions were used to exclude and take away resources from certain individuals and groups. So when we are doing equitable acts and equitable policies and procedures, we are assessing what else needs to be implemented, thought about, what needs to be stopped. It is color conscious. It views inequalities. It views power imbalances. It looks at access to opportunities, access to resources, and it looks at outcomes. It questions patterns in the context of historical exclusion and discrimination. It's heavy work, and it is what we need to do. So here's a graphic now showing you going from my left to my right, diversity, equality, and equity. This is a seismic shift that really we've been going through for around 9 months now. And not to say Stevens wasn't doing part of this, because I want to uplift the work of the men and women who were doing this before me. I always say I may occupy a position that it's the first time that it's a full-time position, but there were folks doing this work long before me, right? And so they were doing this diversity, equality, and equity, moving in that progression. And in some, you'll see that inclusion could be to the right of equity, meaning that it is embedded in every single thing we do, every choice we make. This is what we're striving for at Stevens as we move forward. So I love this quote: our goal is equity by design, to be critical thinkers who possess the ability to go beyond what is presented to us and interpret with a critical lens and a social justice lens. And that's Lasana Hotep. So what resonated with me when I first was exposed to this quote was the fact that we have to go beyond what is presented to us, right? We could look at something today and say, oh, people who, for instance, rent, they just want to rent. They don't understand the importance of home ownership. That limited lens thinking negates the fact that there has been 400 plus years of policies through the US social institution of government that prevented individuals and groups from being able to own a home. So we can't just look at what's right in front of us. We have to say, historically, have there been policies and institutions and procedures that excluded certain groups and included certain groups? Were there groups that were denied access and groups that were granted access? This is our work with equity. So a couple of times you've heard me mention US social institutions. Again, I share with you as a gift. This was groundbreaking for me because, like you, I am a lifelong student of this work. And so when I've been saying US social institutions, or I say the individual, communal, organization, and institutional level, these are our US social institutions: government, medicine, finance and banking, religion, media, education, and legal. Now, why is that important? Let's take a quick pause. We're going to do an exercise. I want you to think, and if those of you who are quick typists, I want you to type in the chat institutions or organizations that were created and maintained by and for white people. Institutions or organizations that were created and maintained by and for white people. So yes, banks, yes, institutions of higher ed, absolutely, law enforcement and policing, the mortgage system, yes, government, yes, retail stores, yes, immigration, yes, public schools, so K through 12 is part of the education, yes, the legal system. I love overachievers. Yes, hospitals, part of our medicine, the executive branch, mental health facilities. So again, part of our medical institution, the structure of capitalism. Yes, judicial, healthcare. I see Hollywood, which is entertainment, part of media, prisons, absolutely, which is part of law enforcement, churches. Yes, parks and national brands. Exactly. So I want you now to drop into the chat institutions or organizations created and maintained by and for people of color. So institutions or organizations created and maintained by and for people of color. So I see the NAACP, I see HBCUs, so those who don't know, historically Black colleges and universities, the Black Panthers. I think I saw local churches, Equal Justice Initiative. It was sold to Viacom, but yes, for about 20, 25 years, it was Black owned. Okay, so great job. I'm seeing specific unions, maybe specific hair salons. So let's pause real quick. Let's go back and think about the huge US social institutions that were listed under institutions and organizations created and maintained by and for white people. So we had government, banking, medicine, huge, the biggest level, institutional level. Many of the things that were mentioned that were created and maintained by and for people of color were much smaller, right? There was not even one sole institution that was named. It was an organization or maybe a civic organization or a particular college or university. So let's move down into the lower left. So now I want you to name institutions or organizations created and maintained by and for white people under whose policies and rules people of color must live. And that's past tense, so that they had to live under, and current tense. So yes, I'm seeing Department of Defense, the legal system, Army, voting, yes, religious, yes, the institution of slavery, FBI, CIA, capitalism, US government, education. Right. So are we seeing that? That those two kind of line up, that the institutions or organizations created and maintained by and for white people, and the institutions or organizations created and maintained by and for white people, under whose policies and rules people of color had to live, as our major US social institutions. So let's answer this final one. Institutions or organizations created by and for people of color under whose policies and rules white people had or must currently live under. Right. None. And so this is called the power analysis. And this is why systemic conversations have to be part of equations around race. We cannot just talk about hearts or intentions, or I knew my neighbor for 10 years and they're a really kind person, so they couldn't be an ist, a racist, a sexist. That misses this. That misses the fact that systemic power, and again, power, the ability to give or take away resources and opportunities, has always been one-sided. It has been that people of color always had to navigate our US social institutions under policies and rules that were not made for them or by them. But we cannot say the same in reverse. So one of my other gifts to you today is that this is why reverse racism on a systemic level is not possible. That is a myth that has been fed to us that we ate. It cannot. On an individual level, can one person of color have racial prejudice plus have some power? Yes. So on an individual level, a person can do an act, but not systemic because of this. Because as a large group, right, across the nation, there are not enough people of color in positions of power to be able to grant and take away resources that white people have to live under. And so this is why systemic conversations are so important. So power is that equation. And specifically to those who are white on this line, I implore you that one of your first takeaways and tasks is you need to have that conversation with other white people in your spheres of influence. You can do that exercise and walk them through it. But the fact that most conversations around race take out or leave out power, then that means we're only talking on the individual and communal level. We are not talking about the organizational and institutional level. Hence why it's important in a time like this that the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, went on CNN and said, there's not systemic racism in law enforcement, there's just some bad apples. Why is that statement problematic? Because the bad apples takes it and leaves it at the individual level. It negates the institutional level, which is the reality that policing in the US has always been to keep people of color, and specifically Black people, whether that was slavery, whether that was Jim Crow, in what they were deemed to be their role, their place. It was not to guard and protect, it was to return property, which at that point were the Black human beings, to the masters. And that translated into Jim Crow, which directly is tied to our industrial complex, our prison complex, and our prison, school to prison pipeline. So power, the ability to grant and take away access, resources, and opportunities. It's the ability to do as individuals or groups or not do, right? And it's the possession of power that equates to the ability to live lives of fulfillment. Power can also be used to destroy and demean. So what are our challenges to be an ally? And you talk about that a lot. You can hear ally, you can hear accomplice, which is something that we're moving towards. But in terms of an ally, it's one whose personal commitment is to dismantling racism. So not just whether you are a good person, what is happening systemically? Racism. You're willing to educate yourself about racism, racial justice, challenge your own prejudices, learn and practice skills of anti-racism, interrupt racist statements, behaviors, policies, and structures. One of my mentors, Sharon Littman Hicks, said a couple of years ago, your job as an ally is to shut, another S word, four letters, shut it down. It is to make your life uncomfortable. And you cannot be a self-appointed ally. You must be anointed by the community that you are aspiring to be an ally to. So what does that mean? You can't do one good act and then call yourself an ally forever. When you consistently show up, trust me, that community will deem you an ally. And they will say, oh, so-and-so is an awesome aspiring ally for people of color, or an aspiring ally for, those of us with disabilities. So an ally is crucial. So racism. So here's another takeaway today. I'm telling you, it's going to make you very unpopular at cocktail parties or birthday gatherings, but this is a choice that I've made. I don't engage in conversations around racism without defining it. So I shared a couple slides back that there's a formula to this. United Nations, South African Delegation, 2001. Racial prejudice is plus the misuse of systemic or institutional power. There you go. So I liken it to when the sun rises and when it sets. I'm not arguing that. I don't have that skill set. I just appreciate the time between those two. I'm not here to talk about hearts and intentions when it comes to racism. This is about racial prejudice plus the misuse of systemic or institutional power. And within that, yes, there's an assumed superiority. So someone's superior, someone's inferior over one group. And we know in the US specifically, that's about skin color. And that power allowed our government, our medicine, our media to dominate, exclude, discriminate against, abuse, and right now, even kill. And that comes from Audre Lorde. The systemic subjugation of one group over another. Again, look at the definitions. Access to social and economic power. A system of oppression and a system of advantage based on race. So when we're talking about Black Lives Matter and policing, we have to hold the discussion at a systemic level. And privilege, because we're almost done. With privilege, we're talking about choices, entitlements, advantages, benefits, assumptions, expectations that were granted on membership in a group, often the advantaged group, the privileged group. And a lot of these privileges happen at birth. So I navigate the world and have as an able-bodied woman. I didn't have to work for that. That's a privilege I've inherited. What does that privilege look like? Up until the disability movement in the 70s, it meant sidewalks, elevators, stairs, homes, doors were made for me to be able to navigate these two legs. That's the assumption, that's the privilege that operated on a societal level. And so I don't have to run away from that or be scared about that. My job is to acknowledge it and then go get direction from those who navigate the world with physical, cognitive, linguistic, and behavioral disabilities to find out what my work is. Because I don't know what I don't know. I don't have the lived experience as a person with a disability. So how can I then try to define for myself what my action would be as an ally, right? It doesn't make cognitive sense. But the work, the uncomfortability is me showing up at a rally that is being planned and executed by folks with disabilities and saying, what's my job? Because when I did that, I had the experience of them saying, Shashawn, yours is to move out the way and make the police arrest us. And I went, what? Like, no, I'm supposed to protect you. And they said, when's the last time you saw a person with a physical disability get arrested, pulled on the local news? You don't, because the inkling would be for the police to arrest someone who doesn't have a physical disability, because that strikes us in our heart, seeing someone carried in a wheelchair or with crutches or a cane. I would have never known that was my job at the rally if I didn't try to show up and shut up as an ally. And last but not least, anti-Blackness. Do your homework. We all have it. So those of us who are Black or people of color, we have some internalized racism. We've drank that Kool-Aid lemonade. And our work, again, is different to minimize that. It's about self-love and relearning histories that were taken from us or were given to us falsely. For white people, the work is to identify where this is for you. Where did you get messages about what Black is, what Black looks like, how Black operates? So it's the personal, cultural, social, legal, and structural attacks on people who are perceived to be and who are actually Black. And why is that important? Because our demographics are changing, as you know, and the majority of people navigating the US will be biracial or multiracial. And it will be our job to make sure that we are supporting and being allies to their identities, because they will be able to identify however they want. And we don't have the right to negate that, but we can learn from it, right? So the next one is sources for you. You all can take time later on to review those. For those of you who are scholars and you just must have resources, I will also let you know that lived and learned experiences are different. And part of our work is to make sure that they are weighed equally. And in some places, the lived experience is elevated over the learned, right? So it's in there, but don't do what sometimes happens. We go, I didn't like that definition, so I'm not going to use that one. Okay, because then you're clinging to the social programming that you received, most likely in your youth. And we are trying to unlearn what we can. So I appreciate your openness, your willingness to sit in the uncomfortability. I know some of this may have been review for some of you, and I thank you for continuing to listen and to look at it maybe through another lens, looking at it through your bold identities or looking at it in aspiring allyship. For those of you who was new, get it. This can be shocking. This can feel different. It's challenging to say, well, I might have gotten messages from a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or a sibling, and I love that person. Absolutely. And they could have been saying racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, anti-Semitic things. And we have to learn to hold space for both, unlearn what they told us, and still love the person. So we want to open it up now. I see that chat has just been exploding. Thank you for being engaging, and thank you so much for putting there. I will do my best to catch up, and what we don't in the next 15 minutes, I commit to follow up with each and every one of you. So we hope at this time that you will share resources. So please drop in the chat resources that have been pivotal to you. I call them gifts, as I did throughout this presentation. But where are you in this particular moment? What are you doing? What are some of the things you all are doing every single day to navigate this space, to be an aspiring ally? For my people of color, what are you doing in terms of self-care and navigating this very tumultuous time? I absolutely want to invite Diane back to the conversation as we do this. And so, and I want to acknowledge, please, Lita, who is our executive assistant, who is behind the scenes navigating the chat and the PowerPoint. And so thank you. She's always the glue to coordinate these events, and our Zoom guru. So Lita, we appreciate your contributions. So I'm going to take a quick minute. In the meantime, there are some, oh, no, go ahead. Diane, will you mind giving feedback? And I'm going to catch up on the chat.
Well, my only feedback is that, Shashan, I've heard you speak a number of times, and there's never a moment when you're speaking that I'm not learning. And your deconstruction of the nuances of language hits home. And I recognize, again, my own confusion. And I care deeply about language, but I recognize and understand a little better the clarity with which you think about these things, and how good you are at educating the rest of us. So I thank you for this and every conversation. I walk away, I feel often confused and humbled and uncomfortable in all the best ways. So we would be happy to compile and collect all of these resources and distribute them to anybody who might find them helpful. But I do appreciate your comment and your observation and clarity about the difference between learned experience and resource learning, because of course those things are different, and some of us who live in academia sometimes need that reminder. So I appreciate that, as I appreciate all of it. Thank you. I know I can tell from the chat everybody shares that, but I'm fortunate enough to have the opportunity to say it here and every day. So
thank you. And I want to acknowledge there's a lot of work. I'm trying to catch up kind of quickly. There's a lot of work going on in the chat, and I want to uplift, looks like Kanisha. Thank you very much, Catherine. So there's, peer education. I always call it wisdom in the Zoom. There is wisdom and educating and conscious rising happening in the Zoom. So I do want to lift and definitely appreciate the fact that when we were doing that power analysis, so the 4 grids, right? For many white folks, the election of President Obama in that perspective was a equal level playing field. It is not, right? Because for 8 years, yes, the arguably most powerful person in the world was a person of color, but he didn't literally run on a daily basis all of the US social institutions. And 8 years cannot undo the 400 that came before it, right? So it cannot undo the institution of slavery. It cannot undo Jim Crow. It cannot undo the prison industrial complex. It can't. And so that's definitely one of those myths that we received. I've never been able to figure out who gets the credit for coining a post-racial US. They were a great spin doctor, but it's probably one of the most harmful myths and lies that was perpetrated, right? We must be able to identify that US social institutions is where this harm happened, right? And that could be from redlining. Who could and could not own a home? That was written into the deeds of homes that Black people could not own homes. Women could not get credit in their own name, right? Until like the early 70s. That's sexism. So if we went back to our formula, sex plus the misuse of institutional or systemic power is sexism, the ability to grant or take away resources. So think of all those years that women were not able to build wealth because they couldn't get access to credit unless a father, brother, grandfather, some male authorized that it was okay. And then if you do the intersections of those two, so like Black women, on average, our net worth is $5. $5 compared to a net worth of $42,000 for white women. So when we talk about the unequal pay gap, that's one thing, because we know that that is different, right? We could put out a press release about women, but the challenge is that that hits differently for Indigenous women, Black women, Latinx women, Asian Pacific Islander women. Same thing. So we didn't get into that here, but I know we're committed to, is that we'll talk about intersectionality, coined by a researcher, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and not the buzz way that they use it, but that actual piece that talks about systemic, right? Who is made vulnerable by our US social institutions. So I want to acknowledge that there's lots of work going on in the chat, and I appreciate all of you. So I'm seeing resources like the book White Fragility. Thank you so much for putting that in there. I think that was Angie. We appreciate Dr. Hardy, who is our founding director of the School of Arts and Humanities. And he says, I'm mentoring my biracial daughter to help her navigate these tragic and transformative times. Absolutely. That the actor Taye Diggs wrote a book with his son that's incredible, that talks about this W.E.B. Du Bois dual consciousness, right? So you have Taye Diggs, who's a darker skinned Black male, teaching his biracial son that the world's going to perceive you as a Black male because of the melanin, and you have the right to define yourself because two people came together to create you, your white mother and your Black father. And that's why I get excited about biracial, multiracial narratives in terms of I can't negate that that's his son's experience. And who am I to tell a son how he can or cannot identify? The magic and the uncomfortable, tough conversations is living in both of those worlds. How are you perceived versus how you identify? For some of us, those things are in alignment. For a lot of us, they are not, right? Become a Better Ally, Anti-Racist Resource Guide. So thank you. I think that's Sally Bollinger who put that one in there. And I see a little bit too about privilege. And so very quickly, I'll share in with privilege. Dr. Laura Nunley quoted a gentleman who's, I think, the VP of one of our local Columbia schools, Emmanuel, I can't think of the last name right now, but she had a great epiphany about privilege being like unconsciously living your life. And the way that I have heard it as well is not having to think of something. So the fact that I was in my mid-30s before I thought if what I was assigned female at birth and the plumbing that I have matched how I knew myself is a privilege. Now the term for that is cisgender. But before I knew that term, what was my truth, what was my work, was to introspect and have that moment when I went, wow, I went 30 some years and never had to think if those two things were in alignment or were not. Unlike transgender folks, often will tell you age 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there, they realized that there was a difference, that the two things weren't in congruence. So privilege, part of our work, and especially for white people, is to not get defensive around privilege. It is to know that it can be fluid. I have privilege right now as the speaker on the Zoom. But as soon as I leave the computer, if I walked into downtown Columbia for some reason, I may lose my privilege, depending on the context. But on a systemic level, we have been receiving, groups of people have been receiving privileges, and other people have been experiencing oppression. And those are the conversations that we have to have, because it makes a difference in our organizations, personnel, policies, procedures, priorities, who we are accountable to, our vision, our mission, can all be impacted by that work. Rebecca Lane has given a thorough list. Yes, Rebecca, into the chat. So we have committed, and Diane's got some great announcements about follow-up steps to this. We've committed to put, there's some resources I put together, specifically 2 for white people. So it's a list that's circulating around Columbia of work for aspiring anti-racist white people in Columbia. So it specifically talks about that. We're going to put that on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion website at Stevens. There's another one that's resources for white people and specifically white parents. And that's a document that's being circulated nationally. And then I put together documents, self-care items for people of color. And then there's also a document, and we will preface it, right, that we are not telling you whom to vote for in November. There is a document, however, that has great research that shows you who are some of the largest donors to the current administration's initial campaign and re-election campaign. And so we think it's important to share that so that you can make a decision of where you do and don't spend your money. Because this is all part of this work. There's not one way to be an anti-racist, but if you're not engaging, then again, you are complicit. But how you engage, you've got a plethora of ways to start. You just got to start. So I want to make sure that Diane has some great things to share about things going on today and post today.
Thank you, Shashan. I have been watching the chat, and I appreciate very much the questions and concerns. And I again ask that we continue to have that conversation, and that we schedule it, and that we bring everybody together to continue to have this conversation. And so I'm not sure exactly to whom I should be reaching out around scheduling that. I know there's a great, there's a group, but I'm happy to have that conversation. We will plan to have that conversation. I'd like to do it early next week so that there's quick and responsive interaction and discussion. And so some of the things that I know are so important are things we all absolutely agree must be done, which includes increasing the diversity in our community and in our faculty and in our hiring, and thinking really critically about the allocation of resources and where we invest, and ensuring that voices are heard and attended to and respected. But again, there's a list, and my understanding is it's growing. And so I would really like to take the time and the energy and focus around that discussion. This really was intended always to be a learning experience for all of us. And Shashan has been working, as you can tell, she's an expert in these things, but she worked hard to put this together for us. And it was really important that we honor that and attend to it. Not only because it speaks to the fact that we all believe that learning is the critical first step, learning and listening, shutting up and learning and listening. And so again, thank you, Shashan. And I clearly from the response, it has been an effective and important way to spend our time together. But that does not mean that we will not spend other time together. And it does not mean that those conversations are any less important or any less critical to the future and the movement forward of our institution. So yes, we will have that meeting, and we will have multiple meetings with our alumni who are passionate about helping us move forward to improve and make Stevens better. We also plan to have a summer series of these kinds of interactions. So yes, we are committing to a weekly session or a weekly meeting, a weekly learning session and discussion section. And I've gotten some feedback that having it at noon is difficult for some people. And in fact, we were trying to be intentional about the fact that many people have come back to work, have gone back to work at the workplace. And so this might be a time easier than early evening or evening. But we can certainly talk about that, and we can certainly adjust that or maybe stagger it so that people have an opportunity whose schedules are different. But Shashan developed a list in the last couple of days for me about the things we should be thinking about. And I went back to her and said, this would be a great series of programs for our community. We plan to, we commit to diversity training for all of our employees. I see that that's come up, and that's certainly on our commitment list. And not just, although we certainly have an extraordinary educator now on our staff and now on my leadership team to help us move forward with that. And so the things that so many of you are suggesting must be done are the things that we absolutely agree must be done. And I believe that we are in a position I believe that we are committed to and pledge to execute and to do it well and to do it quickly. So there is a number of things obviously developing, and we are listening, and we will continue to listen, but more important, we will continue to respond and to call to action all of the members of our community. We have trustees on this Zoom call. We have faculty, we have staff, we have alumni, we have the Stevens community here together, and we all want the same things. We may, as Shashan so eloquently described, we come from multiple identities, multiple lived experiences, multiple academic backgrounds, multiple readings, multiple experience again. And that's a gift, as Shashan would say. That is a gift to all of us. And my hope, my request is that we work together and that we listen to each other. And that the talking is the start, but the action is what matters. So I thank you so much for being with us. I thank Shashan again, as I know we all do, not just for her wisdom and insight, but her eloquence. She is an extraordinary public speaker and educator and teacher. And we are grateful to her and to all of you for being with us. We will be in touch, we will follow up, and we are just beginning this very important work. Thank you.